There is something I keep returning to, and I want to be careful here about how I say it. Not the Tartaria theory, as it's commonly shouted across forums. Not the mud flood, not the impossible architecture. The specific, quiet problem of the soldiers. The ones history wrote out before it was even finished writing them in. Look at a European map from the 17th century. Tartaria occupies an area larger than the entire continent of Europe, an enormous territory stretching from the Urals to the Pacific coast. It appears on French maps, Dutch maps, English maps. Nicolas Whitson, the Dutch cartographer, spent decades documenting it. The land was not imaginary, but here is what every account of that territory consistently fails to produce with any depth: a coherent military structure. There are references, scattered, brief, often dismissive to armies. There are mentions of warriors, and then there is silence. A silence that is strange, precisely because of how vast the territory was. The official explanation is straightforward. Tartaria was not a unified empire. It was a loose geographic designation applied to the peoples of the Eurasian steppe, Mongols, Tatars, various Turkic groups. Their military forces were real but nomadic, poorly documented by Western historians because those historians rarely travelled there. The silence is simply a product of distance and institutional limitation. That explanation is reasonable. I want to acknowledge that directly. The Eurasian steppe was genuinely remote from European centres of scholarship. The men who travelled there, Adam Brand, Evert Jusbrandts, Iders, the Swedish officer Philip Johan von Strahlenberg, were travellers, not military historians. Their accounts are detailed about trade, climate, and geography, less so about warfare. But here is the first crack. Von Strahlenberg, captured by Peter the Great after the Battle of Poltava in 1709, spent 13 years as a prisoner of war in Siberia. He produced one of the most comprehensive geographic surveys of the region ever written, published in 1730. In it, the peoples of Tartaria are described in considerable physical and cultural detail. And yet, for all the precision he applies to geography, language classification, and commercial practice, the military traditions of the peoples among whom he lived for over a decade receive treatment that is strikingly thin by comparison. He was a meticulous man. The disproportion is not what you would expect from a prisoner with 13 years and nothing else to do but observe. I am not claiming that one man's editorial choices prove anything. I want to be clear about that. A single disproportion in a single 18th century geographic survey proves very little on its own. What it does is open a door, and once you start looking, you find that door keeps appearing in different hallways, in different centuries, in the work of very different people. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Scythians, the peoples who preceded many of the steppe civilizations that would eventually fall under the Tartaria designation, as notably tall. His descriptions were dismissed for centuries as characteristic Greek exaggeration about foreign peoples. Then archaeologists began opening Scythian burial mounds across what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. The skeletal remains inside confirmed significant average stature, not mythological, not impossible, but consistently taller than contemporary European populations by a measurable margin. This is documented and not contested. The Scythians were real, their height was real, and they occupied the western edge of what European cartographers would later call Tartaria. Now, the rational explanation here is simple and probably correct. Height differentials between populations are well documented in history. Protein-rich diets, genetic factors, different environmental pressures, these account for stature differences across cultures. The fact that one ancient steppe people was tall does not build a bridge to some suppressed race of warrior giants. I know that, but we are not looking at one data point. We are looking at a pattern, and the pattern has a specific shape. It keeps appearing not in the sensationalist corners of the internet, but in the marginal notes of serious historical accounts, always brief, always as if the writer considered it and then decided to continue forward without lingering. Guillaume de Lisle, the royal French cartographer who produced some of the most detailed maps of Tartaria in the early 18th century, corresponded extensively with travellers and diplomats who had visited the Eastern Territories. His papers survive and are held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The gap between the richness of his private correspondence network and the selectivity of his published work has never been fully examined. De Lisle was a meticulous scholar. He is not known for omitting things carelessly. His maps are celebrated precisely because of their commitment to incorporating every available source. The question of what he chose to leave out of publication is, by definition, a question about what he judged unsuitable, either as unreliable or as something else. That distinction has simply not been rigorously pursued. Now I can hear the objection forming. It is a fair one. Cartographers of that era regularly received exaggerated reports from travellers, missionaries, and merchants who had every incentive to sensationalize what they had seen. Extraordinary physical claims about remote peoples were a staple of European travel literature. The Patagonian giants appear in multiple 16th century accounts. They were not real. The Patagonian giant reports are worth dwelling on for a moment, because what happened to those accounts is itself instructive. They circulated for over 2 centuries. They were cited by serious scholars. They appeared in respected geographic literature, and then, gradually, methodically, they were reclassified as myth. That reclassification was almost certainly correct, but it also established a template. The template works like this. Reports of unusual physical characteristics among remote peoples enter the historical record, are cited by respected figures, and then, when they become inconvenient or when the territory in question comes under closer scrutiny, they are collectively recategorized as travelers' fancy. The process is not dishonest in any individual instance, but it is thorough and it is applied unevenly. Because, if we apply the same skeptical standard consistently, we should also examine why the Scythian skeletal evidence was so easily separated from the broader narrative about steppe military power. The physical facts of the burials were accepted. The military implications, what it means that a civilization producing consistently taller than average warriors held the steppe for centuries, were never seriously pursued. Let me tell you about the Huns, not the popular image, the actual historical record. When Hunnic forces arrived at the edges of the Roman Empire in the late 4th century, the accounts written by those who encountered them describe not just military power, but something about the physical character of the armies that reads differently from standard military description. Amicons Marcellinus, the Roman historian who wrote the most detailed contemporary account of the Hunnic invasions, describes warriors whose endurance, shock resistance, and manner of combat were unlike anything the Roman military had catalogued before. He is a careful writer. He is not given to loose hyperbole, and the language he reaches for when describing the Huns is not the ordinary vocabulary of military history. Again, I am not claiming that Arminius's rhetoric proves a race of giants existed. The Romans described many enemies in inflated terms. Tacitus describes the Germans as enormously tall to serve a rhetorical purpose about Roman civilization confronting the barbarian world. Hyperbole, in ancient military writing, is so common as to be nearly the default register. I am aware of that. What I am pointing to is the specific shape of the language. When Roman writers exaggerate enemy stature for rhetorical purposes, they tend to do so universally. Every enemy is huge. Every enemy is terrifying. Ammianus does something different. He distinguishes. He is specific about which groups, which warriors, which military functions. That specificity is either more careful rhetoric or it is observation. The Hunnic origin is itself still genuinely contested among historians. The theory linking them to the Xiongnu Confederation of the Eastern Steppe, the people whose pressure the Chinese Great Wall was partly designed to manage, remains debated. What is less debated is that the Eastern Eurasian steppe produced repeatedly, and over many centuries, military forces that appeared to emerge from nowhere and proved strikingly difficult to defeat in open field combat. The military record of the steppe civilizations that occupied the territory later designated as Tartaria is one of the most consistent records of military dominance in human history. Genghis Khan's armies did not suffer a significant pitched battle defeat for decades of sustained campaigning. The Mongol Empire, at its height, had never experienced a genuine military collapse in the field. The orthodox explanation for that dominance focuses on tactics, superior cavalry, extraordinary logistical flexibility, intelligence networks, psychological warfare. These explanations are solid. They are well supported. They account for most of what the historical record shows. I have no argument with any of them, but they explain the method. They say very little about the physical capacity required to execute that method across the scale it was executed. Mongol warriors rode for days without stopping. They could sleep in the saddle. Their reported ability to endure cold, hunger, and physical punishment was described consistently by every observer who encountered them: Chinese, Persian, Russian, European. This consistency across hostile sources that had every reason to downplay Mongol capability, is remarkable. It suggests something physiological, something documentable and real. Now here is where I need to be most careful, because this is where the argument most easily slides from historical inquiry into something else entirely. There is a version of this story that attributes steppe military dominance to some kind of racial or genetic superiority, and that version is both factually unsupported and morally dangerous. I want no part of it. That is not what I am examining. What I am examining is a narrower question. Given that the physical capacities of steppe warriors were consistently documented across a wide range of independent sources, why does the academic historiography that emerged from European scholarship in the 19th century treat those accounts the way it does? Not with engagement and analysis, but with a quiet reclassification that moves them from evidence to local colour. The 19th century is important here. It is when the academic architecture of history as a discipline was constructed. The major university presses, the major journals, the major frameworks for categorizing what counts as historical evidence. And it is also, not coincidentally, the period of peak European imperial expansion into Central Asia. Those two facts are not unrelated. Russia, Britain, and China were all extending their administrative reach into precisely the territories that had been labelled Tartaria on earlier maps. The geographic category itself began disappearing from maps in this period, not because the territory changed, but because it was being divided and absorbed by three expanding empires simultaneously. The cartographic erasure preceded the historiographic one. I am not suggesting that imperial administrators ordered historians to suppress evidence of giant soldiers. That is not how this kind of erasure works. What I am suggesting is something more prosaic and more difficult to disprove, that when a territory is being absorbed by a new administrative power, the narrative about that territory gets rewritten in ways that serve the absorbing power. This is not conspiracy, it is institutional gravity. When Russia extended its administrative reach into Siberia and Central Asia through the 18th and 19th centuries, the accompanying historiographic project had a specific interest in portraying the peoples of those territories as historically fragmented and pre-political. A coherent military tradition with documented physical distinctiveness was inconvenient to that narrative, not suppressed, just deprioritized, consistently, across generations of scholarship. The British experience in Central Asia during the Great Game adds a parallel layer. British military intelligence officers who spent years in the region, men like Francis Younghusband, men like Charles Masson, produced detailed reports on the peoples and territories they moved through. Much of that material went into classified military archives and was never incorporated into the academic historical literature. That is documented and not contested. The Chinese record offers yet another layer. The Shiji and the Hanshu, the great Han Dynasty histories, describe the Shijingu with a detail unmatched by Western sources. What those accounts do consistently record is a stratification within the Shijingu military structure, a warrior class maintained on a distinctly different material basis from the general population, separated in diet, training regimen, and social function. A warrior caste maintained on a distinct nutritional and physical training regimen over multiple generations will present different physical characteristics from the surrounding population. This is basic biology. We see it in modern contexts, where generational selection for specific physical traits produces populations that look genuinely different from the general baseline. This does not require supernatural explanation. It requires only time and selection. So what we are potentially looking at, and I want to be precise about that word, potentially, is a documented warrior caste tradition with documented material separation from the general population within peoples that already demonstrated greater average stature than contemporary European baseline populations. What that combination produces, compounded across generations, is not magic. It is selection applied systematically in service of a military function, and this is where the coordination problem becomes interesting. Because if what I have just described is broadly accurate, if there was a warrior caste tradition with measurable physical distinctiveness operating across the enormous territory, designated as Tartaria, then the absence of that fact from mainstream historical literature requires an explanation, not a conspiracy. A structural explanation. How do three separate imperial powers, Russia, Britain, and the Qing dynasty, all moving into the same territory in the same historical period, all produce historiographic frameworks that minimize or ignore the same category of evidence without explicitly coordinating that minimization? The answer is that explicit coordination is not required. Shared institutional interest is sufficient. Each of those powers needed to establish administrative and military legitimacy over the territories they were absorbing. Each needed a narrative in which the peoples of those territories were absorbable. A coherent, documented military tradition with distinctive physical characteristics that suggested an elite warrior lineage was incompatible with the absorbability narrative. So it went quiet, not through decree, through selection. The historians who received institutional support to study the region were studying administrative viability, trade routes, language classification, and religious mapping. The historians who might have pursued the military history of the steppe warrior castes found few institutional pathways for that work. The questions did not get funded. The archives did not get catalogued in relevant ways. The oral traditions did not get transcribed, not because someone said no, because no one said yes. I want to address one more counter-argument before I continue, the most damaging one, honestly, which is that the Tartaria conspiracy theory, as it circulates in its popular form, is not careful, nuanced, or evidence-based. It makes claims about impossible mudfloods, about reset civilizations, about star forts that were energy weapons. It is a framework that absorbs every anomaly and explains everything, which is by definition the character of an unfalsifiable theory. That is a fair and accurate description of much of what travels under the Tartaria label online, and I do not want to launder a speculative inquiry by dressing it in the clothes of legitimate historical investigation while actually importing the conclusions of the popular theory. The question of the warrior castes is not the same question as the mudflood theory. They do not prove each other, but here is what I think the popular theory, for all its excess, is pointing at. It is pointing at a genuine historical lacuna. The peoples of the Eurasian steppe had one of the longest and most sustained records of military dominance in human history. That record is genuinely under-examined in the Western historical canon. The reasons for that under-examination are genuinely tied to imperial interest. That much is documentable. The popular theory fills that lacuna with giants and mudfloods because it lacks the methodological tools to distinguish between what is genuinely missing and what is simply unproven. That is where the serious inquiry diverges from the conspiracy. Not in the recognition that something is missing, both agree something is missing, but in what you do with that recognition, whether you fill the gap with evidence or with imagination. What I am sitting with is the gap itself. Because the gap has a specific shape, it is not the random incompleteness you find when historical records are simply lost to time. The incompleteness of the Tartarian military record has a pattern. The things that are missing are consistently the things that would be most inconvenient to the narrative of steppe peoples as pre-political, fragmented, and available for absorption. Think about what a coherent, documented warrior caste tradition with distinctive physical characteristics would mean, not for the people who had it, but for the powers that needed to absorb the territory it occupied. It would mean not conquest. It would mean the displacement of something organized, something with its own military architecture and its own legitimacy. That is a different kind of history, one that requires a different kind of justification. Von Strahlenberg lived among the peoples of Siberia for 13 years. He learned their languages. He documented their geography with a precision not surpassed for generations. He was, by every measure, the most thorough Western observer those peoples had received. And in his published work, the military tradition of the Eastern Tartarian peoples is treated in fewer pages than his descriptions of the regional river systems. That disproportion is where I keep arriving. Not at the extraordinary claim, not at giants in the conspiratorial sense, but at the question of why a man who spent 13 years in a place, who documented everything, who was precise and meticulous, why that man treated the military tradition of the people around him as if it were incidental, as if it were a footnote in a book about geography and climate. Maybe he thought it was simply not his subject. Maybe the Tsar, whose prisoner he effectively was during the years he did this work, had reasons to prefer the military traditions of the Eastern steppe to remain underdeveloped in the Western literature. Peter the Great's military ambitions in the region were very much active during precisely the period when von Strahlenberg was writing and compiling. These are reasonable explanations, I acknowledge them, and then I notice that they do not change the outcome. Regardless of the specific reason the material was minimized, it was minimized. The pattern exists independent of the individual motive behind any single instance of it. And patterns without obvious individual motives are the ones that require the most careful structural attention. Because when the choices of dozens of historians across a century of scholarship all point in the same direction toward minimizing the same category of evidence about the same territory in the same historical moment, the explanation is no longer individual, it is institutional. Something about the structure of how historical knowledge was produced and distributed created conditions in which these choices were consistently made the same way. The last armies of Tartaria, if we can call them that, which is itself a question, because the territorial designation was never a unified polity, did not lose on the battlefield in any straightforward sense. The Mongol Empire was not militarily defeated, it fragmented, it was absorbed. Its peoples were incorporated into administrative systems with other names. The military tradition did not end with a battle, it ended with paperwork. That ending, administrative rather than military, is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the erasure. When a military tradition ends through defeat, the defeat is recorded. The records of who fought whom, how, and with what capacity are preserved, because the victors want that record. But when a military tradition ends through absorption and administrative reclassification, the record becomes inconvenient to everyone involved. The people being absorbed have no institutional infrastructure to preserve their own records on their own terms. The people doing the absorbing have no interest in preserving records that complicate their legitimacy. And the academic establishment that will eventually write the history of both sides has been trained in institutions funded by the absorbing powers. The silence is not manufactured. It is structural. It is the shape of institutional interest operating quietly at scale. I want to be honest about where this leaves me. Not at a conclusion, not at a theory I am prepared to defend as established fact. I am sitting with a genuine question about what the historical record of steppe military capacity actually contains. How much of what is absent was never documented, and how much was documented and then filtered through a process that had reasons to minimize it. The giant soldiers of Tartaria, as they appear in popular imagination, are almost certainly not what the popular imagination describes. There were no 8-foot warriors with supernatural attributes marching under strange flags across the steppe. That image is a product of internet mythology, and it requires no serious engagement. The myth is not the question, but something was there. A military tradition that held the largest contiguous land territory on Earth for centuries, that produced armies described with consistent awe by every hostile source that encountered them, that left physical evidence of unusual warrior caste physiology in burial mounds now sitting in museums across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and that then, precisely when the territory it defended was being incorporated into new imperial systems, vanished from serious historical literature. Not vanished entirely, vanished into the footnotes, into the marginal notes of travellers who devoted 2 sentences to what they had spent months witnessing, into the private correspondence of cartographers, into the classified reports of intelligence officers whose papers sit in archives that have been accessible for decades and that nobody has examined through this specific lens. That is a different kind of vanishing than the kind that leaves no trace. I am not going to tell you what was erased. I do not know what was erased. What I am telling you is that the shape of the absence is specific, too consistent to be random, too useful to too many competing powers to be coincidental, and too quiet for the scale of what it concerns. The door is here. I have found its outline in the wall. I have not opened it. I am not certain, standing here in the silence of 3 collapsed empires, that anyone ever has.